Hello, everyone, and welcome to Beyond Belief. I'd like to start with something a little bit different today. I'd like to read you a quote from William James, the father of modern psychology. He said, "Divinity lies all around us, but society remains too hidebound to accept that fact. The mother sea and the fountainhead of all religions lie in the mystical experience of the individual." Have you ever had a spiritual experience? Or are you on a quest for one? How do you think it might feel and change you if you did have one? I myself have had a long fascination with religious or transcendent experiences, and it's such a privilege today to interact with somebody who's made a whole study of it. She teaches anthropology and psychology at Stanford University, and it's my great pleasure to welcome to Beyond Belief Dr. Tanya Lurhman. Hello, how are you?
I'm well. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for
Such a
inviting.
pleasure to have you. You have an amazing job and a fascinating career, and I have been studying your work intently.
Cool.
And I have a list of questions to ask you that I think a lot of people will share my interest in.
Okay.
And let's just start out like this. Um, in the United States, from what I can tell, less and less people are attending formal religious services. I just read that, for instance, in Boston, attendance is down 54% in the last couple of years. And as we become, let's say, more distracted and more secular as a society, are less people seeking transcendent experiences in what you've discovered in your work?
Sure. I would say that we can actually show that people who are more secular, and a lot of secular people in America, have fewer of these intense, intimate experiences of the supernatural. Now, that's not kind of uniform. These events creep up on people unexpectedly. They
Right.
often happen to people who are secular. Sometimes that's transformative and, sort of mind blowing. But on average, when you look at the array of events, more people, when people are more secular, they are less likely to have something like that.
Yeah, that seems like it stands to reason that the more secular mindset a person would have, the less that they would probably experience something like that. But I guess
Yeah.
as a follow-up question, do secular people have their own versions of transcendence? Is there something that you could point to and say, like, your average secular person has had something that would count as being, let's call it otherworldly,
Mhm.
metaphysical, transcendence? Or maybe that's not part of what you study, but I'd still be interested in your speculation about it.
So when we did a study recently, when we talked to different groups of people in the United States and abroad, and we asked them a whole set of questions about ways in which they could experience the supernatural. Almost everybody reported something, some sense of an invisible presence at some point, a thought that came to them that didn't feel as if it came from themselves, an experience on sleep and during sleep that seemed to be beyond their own minds. So most
Like a
of
dream or something more than that.
a dream that felt that it didn't come from themselves, or a sometimes when people are in a state of sleep and they're kind of between sleep and awareness, they kind of have a sense of a presence in the room, and often that's negative, but not always. And that presence kind of commands or invites, and those are about a quarter of Americans report those kinds of experiences.
Right.
And this sense that you know, a dream comes from beyond the self. That's pretty common. So these experiences happen. They just happen less to people who don't look for them, don't want them, wouldn't pay attention to them, that kind of thing. So do they happen to people, and people who are secular don't pay attention and don't remember them? That's possible too.
So I want to ask you more about this down the road in our conversation, but I do come from a perspective that would suggest that most people, if not all people, have some kind of transcendent experience. They
Right.
just simply don't label it that way.
Right.
And I'll ask you more specifically about it, but for right now, let me reverse the question.
Mhm.
And I know you've studied very diverse populations, from witches to evangelicals to many different kinds of spiritual people, let's call them.
Mhm.
Do you find the opposite, that some religious people are not looking for it, that there are people who are engaged in religious lifestyles who are not really experiencing transcendence or not seeking it, but nonetheless are going through the motions of religiosity?
Absolutely. So there's a story here about who was interested in hearing God speak. There's certain kinds of people, temperamentally, psychologically, who are more likely to report these experiences, people who are more likely to get caught up in their inner world, to become absorbed in their inner world. They are more likely to have those events, whether or not they're invited by the culture. But different cultural invitations make a difference. So the way that your religion models the world, and I would say models the mind, will affect whether you have those experiences. There's some religions that are very cautious about what you might call an immaterial other. So some religions, some versions of Reform Judaism are uncomfortable with the idea that this talk of divinity is really a metaphor to talk about the world.
Right.
People who feel God's hot breath aren't thinking that way. That's a different model of divinity.
Yes. So interestingly, we have people on both sides then. There are perhaps secular folks who don't realize that they're engaged in
Right.
this invisible other,
Right.
or haven't labeled it that way. And then maybe there's religious people who have less of an interest than we think, who are not seeking it, but are just living a kind of lifestyle for cultural reasons or whatever.
Right.
But I would like to ask you for yourself. There's a reason I suppose that you chose this line of work and this particular line of inquiry. And to frame the question, I thought about this. Harry Houdini
Mm-hmm.
was famously an anti-spiritualist. He actually sort of he was like a spirituality buster. He went around to seances and he pulled the rug from under them and disproved what was going on, and he was like outing frauds.
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed to everybody like, wow, he really hates spirituality. He's on a crusade against it. But the deep truth was, he was somebody who loved very dearly his mother. She
Mm-hmm.
had passed, and he was hoping secretly that he would find a medium who was real and
Mm-hmm.
could tell him something about his mother and create that connection to the next world. So, in other words, his interest in spirituality was veiled but present. So
Yeah.
I'm wondering. My question I'd like to ask you, and it's a bit of a personal question, but is what drove you towards this line of inquiry? What is there a question or that you're trying to answer for yourself? Is there a quest that you're on?
Mm-hmm.
How did you get involved in this kind of work?
That's a great question. So, just on the Houdini point, I remember thinking in my first project when I was hanging around with people who call themselves witches and magicians in London, it kind of brought me in contact with the parapsychology, spiritual researcher world. And I realized that there were at least two kinds of people. There were the people who joined, so in my experience in the 1980s in London, the folks who joined the Society for Psychical Research were the Houdinis. They were really, really interested, but they were kind of getting there by fighting all the way. They were like, there was something that they were really torn about, and they wanted proof, and there was something going on that they were just fighting. the idea that there might be something there. And then there were other people who didn't care so much. They were sort of drawn or they weren't drawn. And I thought that the kind of the folks I was spending time with were drawn. So I think that for me, the deep question has always been, how does the world become real to people? How do people make judgments about what's real? I grew up in a family in which my mom's father was a Baptist minister. My mom, as is common with ministers' kids, it was a bit of a black sheep, and but my goodness, I mean, she never left the church, but she loved Sam Harris. I mean, she didn't believe it, but she had books on spirituality, and she loved Sam Harris, and it's really God doesn't exist, but she didn't leave the church. My dad grew up in a family where the dad was a Christian Scientist. So in Christian Science, as you might know, is a kind of faith in which the faithful person does not consult doctors because
Right.
the intensity of the faith and the sort of illness is a kind of a failure of faith. So my dad became a doctor, and so there was this. I could see there was this. His dad would call up. So I was a toddler, and then I think I was in first grade when he was in residence. So I kind of saw some of this. And his dad never understood what he was doing in New York City in medical school. And then I also, in primary school, I was sometimes called a Shabbos goy. We lived,
Yeah.
we lived in this Orthodox Jewish neighborhood. Everybody I knew was Jewish except for the little Chinese girl up the street. Not everybody was Orthodox, but there are a lot of Orthodox Jews. And, and my mother, the renegade. So to backtrack, I would go to people's houses and I'd turn on and off the electricity on Friday nights, and I'd get a lovely dinner, and people were absolutely lovely. And it was great. But I could tell that this was like not my mother's vision of God, which was completely irrational because my mother didn't really believe in God. And so who cares if, some community thinks that a little Goyish girl turning on the electricity is kind of helpful. I mean, who cares? But my mother, I could tell she couldn't quite process this. And so that's what led me on this quest. Like, how does God become real to people? What does that mean? How do people come to make the judgment that there is this immaterial presence? Kind of, what does it do? How do you interpret it? And so that's my rabbit. Okay.
Does that mean to say that you're trying to answer that for yourself, or do you just simply find it fascinating as a topic, and you have a family background of wondering about it, and are you trying to answer the question, or is it just it's just interesting?
So it's I was raised Unitarian, for a large part. So I mean, this was the formative perspective in my childhood. This was the way that my mother and father, managed my mother's quest for a church and my father's discontent with the church. And so I was going to this church where there was a really strong commitment to the view that it didn't matter. Now, I know that's hard to explain to people and I recognize how complicated that view is. I'm kind of drawn to, sometimes it's called a processual theology. So I realize the difference between my perspective and what, a secular perspective might. There's this line in the Gospels, and it's Matthew 18, maybe. I wouldn't commit to that, but there's a line in the Gospels in which Jesus says, "When two or three are present, I will be there." So you can interpret that as many of our evangelicals do, when two or three of you are present, when two or three humans are present, there is a third or fourth person who is present who is invisible. And there's this different substance, which is a substance of their invisibility. And that's different from human substance. Or you could say, well, there's something about what those two or three people are doing that's making God real. So, that doesn't invalidate the idea that a different kind of substance emerges, or there's a kind of mindish quality to the universe, or that there's an aliveness to the world, that there's a making that humans do, that it plays a role in that. So I don't know. I think about all these things. Um, and I guess temperamentally, I'm sort of a little more drawn to the processual vision, that there's a kind of a making that we do together. And that making matters. It's not just about sharing lovely words, but there's something that kind of matters. Um, and I like that.
Mhm.
But, you know, I've had odd experiences, but I've never, I come from the kind of background that if, Jesus showed up in the corner of the room and said, "Hey, come on," it would be highly consequential to my life. And sometimes I had more cool experiences in the witchy world because it was easier to get on board with, this is a way that people understand the world and experience the world. And if the goddess shows up in the corner of the room, maybe I'm going to treat this more as a psychological story. I mean, so I'm one of those people that's probably affected by the invitations of the world around me. So I don't know, but I would say that I'm less driven to find the right answer about what is the true nature of this stuff, and a
Right.
little bit more interested in, holy cow, people have the most remarkable experiences. And, what do we make of that? And when are they mad? And when are they not mad? And how do we understand that? And how does it change people's lives? And that kind of thing.
Um, it is a fascinating angle for me, and it's one that I've so little considered. Um, Most of my adult life, it has been somewhat either a sort of a quest, and to some degree an ongoing quest, for understanding the truth, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and not necessarily being willing to settle for the convenience of a ritual, or the communal harmony that it generates, or the beauty that's manifest as a result. That's just me. What I recognize, and your book, I just to quickly recommended How God Becomes Real. I have just read, and is a magnificent book, which I congratulate you on. And you talk there about a term you call real making, right?
Mm-hmm.
What the things that people do to quote unquote make God real.
Yeah.
Um, and to quote you, you say, if rather than presuming that people worship because they believe, we ask instead whether people believe because they worship.
Mm-hmm.
So that question to me is of great import. you know are we generating the truth, when we worship, that this is the reality, we have uncovered the true reality of reality, or are we just hitting ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
and well, let me ask you about that first, and I'll go on for a minute. Well, I'll actually wait. It seemed to me, as I read that quote, that
Mm-hmm.
it's not so dissimilar than putting on a play. you know, there are sets, there are costumes, there are themes, and those themes might be really moving. And I've always wondered at how wild it is that a play is unfolding. It's obviously not real. Everyone in the audience knows that it's just happening right in front of them. It's fake. And nonetheless, it can move them to tears, and it can make them laugh. And like, people are deeply engaged in whatever's going on.
Right.
How is the religious service dissimilar to a play?
Well, it's not. What's different is that, so I think of there being sort of two things, and I sort of talk about them as a faith frame and as the act of kindling. There is so to use an academic phrase, the cognitive attitude with which you hold whatever it is that you're doing. And one of the things that's really different from a play versus going to church or going to synagogue is that people typically treat the play or reading a novel as if it's something to do that's obviously fiction, and they treat the religion differently. I actually think that they always treat the religion differently than other things in the world. I mean, there's something, even if you're absolutely completely devout, there's something a little different about the goddish stuff, because people don't treat God like they never, the most devout people do not ask God to feed the dog, even though God
Right.
obviously has that capacity. So there's something that's funny about how they're holding that, framing this set of ideas in their mind. And then there's the experienced realness of what's happening. One of the things that, so religion and plays and fiction use a lot of the same techniques if they're going to be successful. So you need to create for religion, a vivid, imaginative world. Otherwise, it's just not going to stick. And there are, so if there are these vivid ideas that are really elaborate, that you can kind of enter in with other people and you share those ideas together, and you have rules that say, okay, now this is what counts as God showing up, and this is what does not count as God, and this is what counts as not God but maybe supernatural. So you need all these rules. You need these rules to describe how you're going to interact with God. And then if you learn those rules as a member of that community, you will start to have that sense that God shows up. That's not everything. It's super helpful to be a certain kind of person, to, think of the mind in certain kinds of ways. It's super helpful to have one of these transcendent experiences, because that helps to make the God more real. But the challenging thing for someone like you is that people have these vivid senses of divinity when, to some people, they're quite sure that that's not divinity, right? I
Right.
mean, this is the deep existential question. So people, I don't talk about it so much in this book, but people, when they're mad for a period of time, they often have very vivid experiences of God, and very few onlookers are willing to say, "Oh, that's God." So, knowing all that doesn't solve the problem of when is it real and to whom is it real, and you still have to have a lot of humans engaged in that process. But it is,
So
yeah,
there are some faith traditions that downplay the set, that insist on having no representation
right,
of the deity, who
right,
actually de-emphasize the cathedral or the
right,
synagogue, the wanting to have it as plain and uninspiring as possible. And I know in my tradition, it's better to pray towards a blank wall than it is at the Grand Canyon.
hmm
You
hmm
should be concentrating on, with your mind's eye on the ultimate transcendence, and not try to be inspired by the vision in front of you. Um, what would be wrong? I guess I don't think you're going to say there's something wrong with this, but is an intellectual approach not sufficient? Wouldn't it be okay to go ahead and try to prove it to yourself through philosophy, through logic, through scientific analysis, where it's applicable, and then just to live that and not have to? Is that a form of real making in your estimation, or does real making more along the ritualistic?
Oh, I think it can work. It's just harder. I mean, I read in a Russ Duthat. I'm not never sure if I'm pronouncing his
Yeah, yeah,
name
yeah.
right.
New York Times.
New
Yeah.
York Times guy. Last Sunday or the Sunday before, he had a piece saying like why you should believe in God. It lays out all these scientific reasons, and I read it and I thought, how many people are going to read this column and like be persuaded that God is real if they started reading it as an atheist? I think it's just harder. I think it's like, there, I remember having sort of the conversation that we're having now with one of my close friends in college. And I said something like, you said, which is like, hey, Durkheim thought that moral humanism was the way to go. You didn't need a God. You had these rational understandings of shared moral commitments. You arrived at the correct way to live a life. And my friend said, yeah, that doesn't work for people. And at the time, I had this, heated argument with her. And and she threw other things into the mix. One of the things she was arguing was, well, does it really hurt people so much not to believe in evolution? They get God out of it. Is that really so costly? And so we had a very heated argument about this, because I felt that you should really have evolution was important, as that people should know about. But it is true that I think it's pretty hard to make a secular moral humanism stick as much. It doesn't mean that it's wrong. It's just hard. One of the things that makes Judaism so effective as a faith is that, you can, because of the structure of the faith, that Christianity puts the belief commitment right up front and center. You got to say it out loud if you go to a church for, most Christianities. And Judaism, you don't really, it's, this is, of course, your territory. Forgive me for being an elephant tromping along. But, Judaism,
No worries.
Judaism is really more about those acts of observance, the mitzvot. So
Right.
if you are, I spent time in an Orthodox or neo-Orthodox shul for 10 years ago. I write about it a little bit in this book. And I was really struck by the number of frank atheists in the shul. But they were really able to be involved with the community and to feel very Jewish because of the intimacy and the power of community life. And so there is this kind of rule people are supposed to follow, which is that they're only supposed to eat certain kinds of food, which you can't get at an ordinary restaurant. It has to be a special restaurant that is a kosher restaurant. So that means can't go out to dinner with a bunch of other people, or if you do, you've got to have all these. It gets a little complicated, and
Yes.
special plate, a paper plate, or levels of observance. There's all this sort of stuff people do. But I was, the community can eat with each other. Members can eat with each other, and they always seem to eat at least 2 big meals a week with each other.
Right.
And that was really powerful for a sense of identity, for a sense of understanding what this kind of the shared purpose of the community was. So I thought, so if you've got that kind of structure, you can afford a little less, vivid invisible person showing upness.
Yeah.
And still have a pretty active religious life.
So I want to clarify what I was saying earlier about logic and intellectualism. I wasn't making there an argument for secular humanism, but
I know.
rather, but arguing that maybe it's possible for within religiosity itself to approach it that way.
Yeah.
And just as an example, you seem very knowledgeable about the Jewish traditions, but the 10 Commandments, which many people are quite familiar with, I often ask people if they know what the first one is. And some people do, most people don't. It's translated. If you read it, it would say, "I am the Lord your God." That's the first of the 10 Commandments. Well, it doesn't seem much like a commandment. It just seems like a statement. So that's understood as a requirement to demonstrate to the practitioner that God exists, that it is real, which is a funny thing to do since God was in the middle of revealing himself on Mount Sinai, presumably when he gave that commandment. So it's just, we're having a conversation and I say, Dr. Lurhman, please, believe in me. I need you to believe in me. And we're having a conversation. It's a strange thing to say, but
Right.
as the human psyche is, it's prone to forgetfulness and to lack of clarity and doubt and all kinds of things. And therefore, part of the puzzle is the need to refurbish and upkeep your level of understanding of
Mhm.
this. So I do think that there are some traditions that yes, they're involved in real making, but real making really, like that, there may be actual lines of inquiry and philosophical argumentation that really hold water and that are
Oh, sure.
worth. And for
Yeah.
some people, and I think part of the purpose of this program that we have here is to try to demonstrate a rational basis for belief, to show that there can be a synthesis between scientific endeavor and theological endeavors, and just and to point out that it's not all Bronze Age hokum from that's no longer applicable, and have a real discussions about that. But so it's just a comment on the you're making a fantastic argument and point, I think, in all of your work that I've come across so far, which is yes, where everyone is involved in real making.
Mhm.
The question is, how ultimately successful is it?
Yeah.
Um, and okay, let me pivot for 1 second.
Yeah.
Um, in your we One of the things that I think you would agree with me, you're a psychologist. You study
Anthropologist
psych,
with a foot in psychology.
right? Okay. There's been a great increase in recent times in anxiety, depression, suicide rates, especially among young people. We'd have to argue, I think we'd have to conclude that something is wrong.
Mhm.
What the ultimate causes of it are debatable. Some people would say technology, some people would say many distraction, many things. Do you think that the lack of participation in real making, in transcendent experience, is harming people emotionally?
So I guess the way I would say that is that there's pretty good evidence that if you are involved with a God that you experience as loving you, you're healthier. So I'm not sure I feel comfortable saying that not being involved with such a God makes you less healthy. I do think that if you are involved in such, so this is like one of the really robust things about social science. Being involved with faith is good for your body. It's good for your, reduces psychiatric disorders, improves the immune system, improves your cardiovascular function. There are a lot of discussions about why that is. And the answers run from you're more religious, you're less likely to, use drugs, drink immoderately, or have, sex outside of marriage. That's one way of thinking. Another way of thinking is that loneliness is terribly costly for humans. So, feeling lonely has the same health consequences of like smoking a pack of cigarettes a day.
Is that
That's
right?
yes, I think it's really yes.
Wow.
It's really costly. And so, and being involved in a church makes, or a shul or whatever, um, or a temple, or a coven, it makes you less lonely for two reasons. First of all, you get actual friends in the social group. Um, that matters. They show up with dinner when you're not feeling so well, but they're also like people to talk to and argue with and whatever. The other thing is that God becomes a social relationship. So what I was really struck by, so in this book, I'm not trying to answer the question of whether God is really, in the absolute sense is real, but how God comes to feel real for people, this
Right.
kindling business.
Right.
And, one of the things I thought was so remarkable in the work that I've done is that in many different settings, I can see that as people go to efforts to engage in the rituals and read the stories um, and do the prayer, they're more likely to have the experience that there is another being who's autonomously responding. So you can show that you don't need God to be real for this human experience to happen. So you can just make up a friend and come to experience the friend as responding. But the fact that humans are able to have that sense of an autonomous other, if that human believes that that this other being loves them, that's fantastic. It's just really much better for the body. And I think there is, quite a lot of data that supports that.
And presumably they really need to believe it. It's not something that you can be sort of half-half about.
Well, no, that's a more complicated question. So again, I think I kind of separate out what I would call the faith frame, this cognitive attitude that you have, from these ways in which you real make. So you pay attention, you do these practices, you pray, you think, you talk, and you come to feel that this other talks back. So my favorite recent example of this, I don't think I talk about it in this book, is something called tulpomancy.
Okay.
So tulpomancy, sort of spelled like tulip, but not quite. So tulpomancy is that people make tulpas. You can find this on the internet. I mean, thousands and thousands of people do this. And so people set out, and this is a non-metaphysical community for the most part. They decide they're going to create an invisible being. And some of them create a pony, some of them create a fox, some of them create a person. And they do these practices, which are an awful lot like prayer practices, involve the same technique, so that then they're two dominant techniques. They sort of narrate their day to this imagined friend. So people, and this is what people do. They decide, okay, I'm lonely. I'm going to make a fox. I'm going to make an invisible fox to hang out with me. And they do two things. First of all, they just start talking to their invisible fox. Second of all, they spend a lot of time using what I would call inner sense cultivation. They see in their mind's eye, they hear in their mind's with their mind's ear. They try to feel the fur of the fox. They might draw the fox. They spend a lot of time representing the fox. And after a certain amount of time, maybe 3 weeks if they're doing this hours a day, they will have the sense that the fox is talking back. They have to keep doing this for the fox to retain its autonomous character. They start without any sense that the fox is actually real. Then there becomes this huge debate in the community. They're also online a lot. They're talking to each other. There's this debate in the community about whether the tulpa is really real and whether it is an act of murder to disattend to your tulpa. So the tulpa starts to feel real. So they then have this question, well, is it really real? But in any event, the point is that you don't really have to believe in God to experience God as real. You can do what the tulpamancers do and have the sense of an autonomous other, but then it does start to feel real. So,
that is fascinating, and I've never heard of it. And I'm as you're explaining it, I'm thinking of secular people looking at religious people and thinking like, well, you guys are pretty much engaged in that, a very formalized old version of that, and and that's a reasonable question to ask, and and leads to the other questions the other points I was making earlier with with what rigor can you bring to bear on your belief, and how important is it? Are you doing the first commandment of proving, not just thinking, not just inventing, but actually proving to the extent that proof is possible with anything, to yourself. This is actually actual as opposed to imaginative, um, which is it's wild, and I'm very motivated to go check that out. Um,
It,
but yeah, go ahead.
these are hard questions. There's another related hard question. So I don't weigh in on what's really real, what's kind of true out there. That's not my job. That's your job.
That's my yeah.
That like there's a puzzle of like what's going on with Ezekiel. So
Yeah.
Ezekiel is this prophet in the Hebrew Bible. Ezekiel, if you were going to look at the way Ezekiel conducts himself, he kind of looks like the biblical narrator is describing somebody with psychosis. Right? You could say, okay, there are a lot of symbolic reasons why you might do this. Here's a sky. There's this exodus. Everything's a disaster. Maybe there are a lot of reasons for this, for a prophet to be described as having very powerful, weird ideas. But this is a guy who hears commands from God more than anyone else. God commands him to eat some of the Torah. He's like munches away. He hears people talking, invisible beings talking behind him. Characteristic symptoms of schizophrenia. So let's say Ezekiel is being portrayed as somebody who is psychotic. Does that invalidate his prophecy? Again,
That's a good question. That's a great question. That is something that is worth exploring in an entire other segment. Yeah, of course. And the same could be asked of Isaiah and Jeremiah and anyone that we deem, that we claim prophecy for. And it opens the whole can of worms of exactly what is prophecy. How do we know if prophecy has actually unfolded? Are there ways of testing that intellectually? Can we look at a prophecy that's been made and see if it's come to pass, and check out the likelihood, or the unlikelihood of such an event taking place? And I do think that there's a lot to say on that topic. But your point is very well taken. That taken in a vacuum, Ezekiel could easily seem nuts, which I do not think he is. For the record, and the things that are said, especially in the opening chapter, which is very, very highly laden with symbolism, are fascinating things, especially approached from a Kabbalistic lens, which I think helps explain it well. But I understand exactly what you're saying, and I appreciate where you're coming from, in saying you are studying the way that people for themselves make these things real, and there is a fascination in that by itself, which I totally appreciate. I've two more questions, and I see that we're getting close to the time limit, but I knew we wouldn't get to all of them. But going back to what we were talking about earlier about secular people having ritual, what do you think of the idea of music as a transcendent experience? That if I hold that there's no overt evolutionary value to music, it's not clear why people are doing it. It just sounds, yet people dedicate their lives to it and have all kinds of rituals with concerts and whatnot. Is music a version of a transcendent ritual?
Absolutely. So, I mean, whatever music is, it's pulling on the same capacities that religiosity pulls on, whatever we mean by trance. That sometimes is a scary word, but it really describes the capacity of being lifted out of your everyday world and being captured by something that feels bigger and beyond.
Right.
So I think that music does do that. Until relatively recently, all music was religious music. And I think that that's, no accident that it serves that role.
And what about prayer? You talk about that in this book.
Right.
And you define it as the act of deliberately turning one's attention towards God or spirit and speaking to it.
Hmm.
And you ask the question, how does prayer change the one who prays? So that's my last question for you today is, how does prayer change people who pray?
Well, in many ways. I think that prayer works for people whether they are religious or not. And it's actually remarkably similar to cognitive behavioral therapy, in that you are really being asked, you're being asked to identify, first of all, you're turning your attention from the niggling stuff of the day to positive thoughts. You're thanking. My favorite example of this was listening to a Christian in Chicago in a place that has miserable winters. And, she's talking about becoming a new Christian, and she's talking about walking out of her building, and it's a miserable winter day. And she says, "Thank you, God, that it's not sleeting." And she promptly slips on the ice. But I mean, she's like, but you're shifting your attention from what what's agitating you to your gratitude. You are then focusing on trying to take sort of negative thoughts out of your mind and to replace them with positive thoughts. You know, you know, Lord, thy will be done, not mine. I mean, however you imagine it, focusing on how to think in a way that's supportive of your life goals and diminishes the kind of negative stuff. And it helps you to set small goals. I mean, that's all. Again, it's all cognitive behavior. I mean, I want to diminish it by saying it's cognitive behavioral therapy. I just want to point out that what you're doing in the act of prayer is fundamentally therapeutic. And if part of that process is really believing that there is a loving person who is talking back or listening, just listening to you, it's clearly better for your body. It's like, some of the evangelical Christians I spent time with, talked about prayer like talking to an imaginary friend, where they're not doing the Lord's Prayer, not davening these kind of structured prayers, but they're just whinging at God. And then they kind of calm down. And then they thank God for what's going on, and they make a plan to be less agitated the following day. And because God feels real to them, they feel comforted by that. So I'm pretty impressed by the power of that practice. I think of prayer as the most sort of really the central ritual practice of faith.
Well, Dr. Lurhman, you are a fascinating thinker, and your work is a really great contribution to the intellectual scene, and I really have appreciated getting to know you and your work. So thank you so much for being here, and I wish you all the best, and I hope you continue to expose these great ideas and teach us more and more as time goes on.
Thank you very much. It's been a really interesting conversation. Thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure. And just before we go, please take one moment to subscribe to our YouTube channel just below. Please like and comment as well. And as always, we'll be back next time with more fascinating people and more ideas. Thank you so much for being here.